Mother drove 2 hours to our house with a fever of 101. I didn't find out about the fever until she was already pulling into our driveway. She'd called me from the road, voice rough and thin, and said she was fine, just a little tired, probably allergies. I knew she was lying. My mother has been downplaying her own pain my entire life. She broke her wrist once and called it a sprain for 3 days before my dad dragged her to urgent care. So when she showed up at our front door, with glassy eyes and a flush across both cheeks, I wasn't surprised. I was scared, and I was grateful she was there, and I immediately took her bag from her hand and told her to sit down. My husband was in the living room when she walked in. He looked up from his laptop, gave a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and said, "Hey, Carol. Didn't realize you were coming today." I had told him, twice, once on Monday and once the morning she left. I let it go. My mom, being my mom, apologized for the short notice. She apologized for coming at all, actually, which broke something small in my chest. "I just didn't want to be alone," she said quietly. "The apartment gets so big when I'm not feeling well." She'd been living alone for almost 3 years, since my dad passed. The apartment she's talking about is 800 square feet. It does not get big. It gets quiet. That's worse. I set her up in the guest room, made her tea, found the good blankets she always liked when she visited. My husband came to the doorway of the kitchen while I was heating up soup and said, "How long is she staying?" "A few days," I said, "until she's feeling better." He made a sound, not a word, just a sound, low and exhaled, the kind that means something without committing to saying it out loud. I turned around. She's sick and she's alone. She drove 2 hours. What did you want me to say? "I'm just asking how long," he said. He walked back to the living room. I finished making the soup. The next morning, I woke up early to check on her. She was already awake, sitting up in bed with her phone in her lap, trying not to cough too loudly. Her fever had gone up overnight. I took her temperature, 102.4, and made a mental note to call her doctor when they opened. My husband came downstairs, saw me at the guest room door, and said nothing. He made his own coffee. He left for work without saying goodbye to either of us. My mom noticed. She doesn't miss things, even when she's sick. "He seems stressed," she said, which was her way of being charitable. "He's fine," I said. She looked at me the way mothers look at you when they know you're protecting them from something, and they're letting you. But they see it clearly anyway. That day I worked from home, answered emails from the couch, ran back and forth to check on her, made sure she had water and crackers and something to watch. She slept a lot. I called her doctor and got her on a telehealth appointment. Nothing serious. A respiratory infection, some rest, fluids, the usual. I felt the knot in my shoulders loosen by about half. When my husband got home that evening, I had dinner on the table. He sat down, ate, and asked how my day was in a tone that suggested he was performing normalcy. I answered the same way. "How's she doing?" he asked, nodding toward the hallway. "Better, I think. Doctor said rest and fluids." "Good." A pause. "So probably just a day or 2 more." I set down my fork. "She's sick, not inconvenient." I didn't say inconvenient. "You didn't have to." He looked at me for a long moment, then went back to his food. We finished dinner without speaking. Later, when I went in to say goodnight to my mom, she was sitting up watching a nature documentary with the volume low. She looked a little better, more color in her face. She patted the bed next to her, and I sat down and we watched penguins for 20 minutes without talking, and I thought, this is what I needed too. Just to sit next to her, just to be near her while she healed. My mom stayed 3 days total. By the 3rd morning, her fever had broken and she was making her own tea and talking about driving home. I tried to get her to stay 1 more night. She said no, she didn't want to impose. That word again, impose. I hugged her at the door for a long time. She whispered, "He'll come around," and I didn't ask what she meant because we both already knew. My husband waved from the couch. After her car disappeared around the corner, I stood on the front porch for a minute by myself. The air was cold. I could hear the neighbor's dog barking somewhere down the street. I thought, I should feel relieved that she's better. That's what I felt. Mostly, underneath that, something else. Quiet and small, and not quite named yet. I went back inside. My husband said, "That was tough. 3 days with a sick person in the house is a lot." I nodded. I didn't trust myself to answer. This was in October. I want to be clear about the timeline because it matters. November came and went. Things between us had that particular kind of normalcy that isn't really normal. It's just two people being careful around each other. We were polite. We made dinner and watched shows and had the kind of conversations that stay on the surface of things. I had learned, somewhere in the 6 years of our marriage, how to read the temperature of a room by the way he set his keys on the counter. That month, I kept waiting for something to thaw. It didn't, quite. Then in early December, he mentioned his mother. She was coming for Christmas. "How long?" I asked. I didn't mean it the way he'd said it to me, but I heard the echo anyway. "Probably 10 days, he said. "Maybe 12. She hasn't been here since we remodeled, and she wants to see the house." 10 to 12 days. My mother, who was sick and grieving and hadn't wanted to be alone, had stayed for 3. I want to be fair here. I've always tried to be fair about his mother. She's not an unkind woman. She's difficult in the particular way that some people are difficult. Not because they're cruel, but because they've never had to consider how they take up space. She talks over people without noticing. She rearranges things in your kitchen. She has opinions about how you load the dishwasher, and she shares them. None of that is malicious. It's just exhausting. But I said okay. I said, "Okay, that sounds good. It'll be nice to have her here for the holidays." I meant it, or I was trying to. He called his mother that night, and I could hear him from the next room, laughing, animated, excited in a way I hadn't seen from him in weeks. He told her about the remodeled bathroom and the new couch and said she was going to love it. He talked for 45 minutes. I sat on the other side of the wall and did not say one word about October. His mother arrived on the 21st. I had cleaned the house. I had put fresh flowers in the guest room. The same guest room where my mother had been sick 2 months before. The room where I'd brought tea and crackers and sat on the edge of the bed watching penguins. I put a candle on the nightstand and made sure the towels were the good ones. He picked her up from the airport. I stayed home and made sure dinner was almost ready when they got back. She came in the front door, and the energy in the house shifted. He was louder, happier. He carried both her bags without being asked. He took her coat. He said, "Come see the bathroom. It turned out so good," and they disappeared down the hallway together, and I stood in the kitchen, finishing the salad. Dinner was warm and easy. She complimented the house, complimented the food, asked about my job with genuine interest. I kept thinking, this is fine. This is good. I can do this. That night, after she went to bed, he said, "Thank you for making her feel so welcome. It means a lot." "Of course," I said. He kissed me on the forehead and I stayed very still. The next 4 days I cooked. I cleaned up after cooking. I drove her to a few stores she wanted to visit because he was working from home and needed to be on calls. I sat with her in the afternoons and listened to stories I'd heard before. I smiled. I was present. On day 5, I woke up with a headache that felt like a blade above my left eye, the kind that comes from tension that's been living in my jaw and shoulders for too long. I lay in bed for a few extra minutes, trying to breathe through it, calculating what was on the day's agenda. Breakfast for 3, her suggestion that we drive out to some garden center 40 minutes away. Dinner. I got up. I made breakfast for 3. Over eggs, she mentioned that she'd noticed the guest bathroom towels were a little worn and maybe I should replace them before her next visit. I said, "I'll keep that in mind." Later that afternoon, while she was resting, I sat in our bedroom with the door closed and called my best friend. I just needed to hear a normal voice. I talked for 20 minutes, said nothing I hadn't already known, hung up feeling slightly better. When I came downstairs, my husband was on the couch with his mother. Some old movie playing, both of them laughing at something. He looked up and smiled at me. A real smile. One of the ones I recognized from before all the careful politeness. And I thought, okay, This is what it's for. This is why I'm doing this. I sat down with them. I watched the rest of the movie. Day 7. 11 days still remaining. I was rinsing dishes when I heard her say from the living room, "She works a lot, doesn't she?" And my husband said, "Yeah, she's really focused on her career." There was a tone in it, not quite pride, something more like explanation, like he was accounting for something. "Your father always said a home needs someone who actually wants to be in it," she said. The water was running. He might have thought I couldn't hear. He said nothing in response. No correction, no pushback, nothing. Just let it sit there. I turned off the tap. I dried my hands on a dish towel. I stood at the kitchen counter for about 30 seconds. Then I went upstairs, sat on the edge of the bed, and looked at my hands. I thought about my mother. I thought about her driving 2 hours with a fever because she didn't want to be alone in a quiet apartment. I thought about the word impose and the way she'd said it like she'd already internalized it from somewhere. I thought about my husband making that sound, not a word, just a sound, when I said she'd stay a few days. I thought about the fresh flowers I put in that guest room. I thought about 10 days, maybe 12. I got up and went to the closet. I pulled out my large duffel bag. I started folding things into it. Jeans, a few sweaters, my good shampoo, my charger, the book I'd been trying to finish for 2 months. I wasn't panicked. I wasn't even particularly upset, which surprised me. I just felt clear. Specifically, quietly, unambiguously clear. He found me in the bedroom about 20 minutes later. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Packing a bag," I said. A pause. "Why?" I set down the sweater I was folding. I turned around and looked at him. He was standing in the doorway with his hands slightly open at his sides, the way people stand when they're trying to look unthreatening. And I noticed that he looked genuinely confused. Not guilty, not caught, just confused. And something about that told me everything. "When my mom came in October," I said, "you made me feel like she was an inconvenience. She was sick, and she was grieving, and she drove 2 hours alone. And you made sounds at me in the kitchen and asked me how long she was staying on the day she arrived." He opened his mouth. "I'm not finished," I said, not loudly, just clearly. "She stayed 3 days. She apologized for being there. And you barely said goodbye when she left." I was stressed with work. "Your mother has been here for 7 days. I've cooked every meal. I drove her to 3 different stores. I sat and listened to her for hours. I put fresh flowers in that guest room. I have been nothing but welcoming." I paused. "And 20 minutes ago, I stood in the kitchen and heard her say that your father believed a home needs someone who actually wants to be in it, and you said nothing." He was quiet. "I'm not leaving," I said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm going to stay at my friend's place for a couple nights because I need some space to think and because I am not able to continue being in this house right now without saying something I can't take back. But I'm not done. I need you to understand what just happened." "Babe." "What would you have said," I asked, "if my mother had said that about you?" "In my kitchen. To me. While you were in the other room." He didn't answer. "That's what I thought," I said. I picked up the duffel. "I'll be back in 2 days, and when I am, I need to have an actual conversation with you. Not a careful one, a real one." I walked past him. I walked down the stairs. His mother was in the living room, and she looked up from the television, and I said, "It was so good to see you. Enjoy the rest of your time here," and I meant about 40% of it, which I thought was honest under the circumstances. I got in my car. I drove. I cried for the first 20 minutes, which I hadn't expected since I'd felt so calm. The kind of crying that isn't really about sadness. It's about release, about something that's been held under pressure, finally finding an exit. I cried and drove, and after a while the roads opened up and I stopped crying and turned on the radio and just drove. My friend met me at the door with wine and didn't ask a single question until I'd been sitting on her couch for 10 minutes. Then she said, "Tell me." So I told her. She listened the whole way through without interrupting, which is one of the things I love most about her. At the end, she said, "The flowers in the guest room." "Yeah," I said. "That's the part that gets me." "Me too." We sat with that for a minute. "What do you want to happen?" she asked. I thought about it. The real answer, not the surface one. I want him to understand that what happened in October cost something, and I want him to understand that I'm not going to keep absorbing the cost of it while also performing gratitude for the privilege. She nodded slowly. "That sounds like a conversation that needs to happen." That's what I told him. I came home 2 days later, as promised. His mother was quieter than she'd been. I don't know what he said to her or if he said anything. But she was different. Offered to help with dishes, asked about my work with less of the tone I'd been navigating. Small things. I noticed them. He and I sat down that evening at the kitchen table, the same table where we'd eaten 7 days' worth of dinners in various configurations of pretending everything was fine. He started with, "I didn't realize how it came across." "I know," I said, and I did. That was almost the harder thing to sit with. He wasn't calculating. He'd just never thought about it. My mother had been to him an interruption. His mother was, to him, a given. He'd never examined the gap between those two things because no one had ever asked him to. "That's not an excuse," he added quickly. "No," I said, "it's not." We talked for almost 2 hours. Some of it was hard. There were a few minutes where his voice got defensive and I had to wait it out and come back in when he was ready to actually listen. We talked about October. We talked about the kitchen comment and the silence that followed it and what that silence communicated even if he hadn't meant to communicate anything. We talked about the word impose and why I hated that my mother had learned to feel it. He said, "I want to do better." I said, "I need you to do better. There's a difference." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. "You're right. You're right, and I'm sorry." I looked at him across the table. This man I'd married. This person I had chosen. With all his blind spots and his laptop and his sounds that weren't words. And I thought about whether I believed him. I decided I did. Provisionally. With the understanding that belief is not the same as proof, and that proof takes time. "Okay," I said. His mother went home 3 days later, which was 2 days earlier than originally planned. I made her a good breakfast before she left, and I meant it. All of it that time. The house felt like hours again after she was gone. Just hours. That particular quiet that isn't loneliness, just space. That night he asked me, carefully, "How are you feeling?" I thought about my mother on that guest room bed, about penguins on a low-volume television, about the flower I put in a vase for a woman who'd been treated like a problem. "I'm okay," I said. "But we're not done talking. Not about this, not about any of it." He said, "I know." I said, "Good." And I meant that too, all of it entirely, without reservation. I keep coming back to the flowers. Not the argument, not the packed bag, not the 2-hour drive home from my friend's couch. The flowers I put in that guest room, the ones I cut stems on and arranged in a vase and placed on the nightstand next to a candle, for a woman who had just spent 7 days watching me serve her without once asking if I was okay. That's the detail that stays with me, not because it was dramatic, but because of what it reveals about who I was trying to be, and whether that version of me was sustainable. I think about my mother a lot when I think about this. The way she said impose, like she'd already been taught to feel it before she even arrived. I didn't teach her that, but I hadn't done enough to undo it either. I had let my husband's sounds and sighs and loaded questions shape the atmosphere of our home in ways I kept smoothing over instead of naming. That's not wisdom. That's just maintenance. And there's a difference between tending something and keeping it from collapsing. What I've come to understand is that the way we treat the people who love us quietly, the ones who don't demand, who apologize for needing, who drive 2 hours sick because they don't want to be alone, that's where our real character lives, not in the grand gestures. In what we do when no one's performing for anyone. My husband wasn't cruel in an obvious way. He was indifferent in a specific, directional way. And indifference, when it's aimed at someone you love, is its own kind of cruelty. The intelligence I needed in that moment wasn't the kind that wins arguments. It was the kind that could see clearly, past my own exhaustion, past the careful politeness we'd built between us, past the version of the story where I was just being oversensitive, and name what was actually true. My mother had been treated like an interruption. His mother had been treated like a guest of honor. I had put fresh flowers in the same room for both of them, and only one of them deserved that from me in that moment. Seeing that clearly, and being willing to say so, was harder than anything else I did in those weeks. And then there's the part that took everything I had, staying, not leaving for good, not dissolving into the situation, but sitting down at that kitchen table 2 days later and having the real conversation, the one where his voice got defensive and I had to wait, the one where I said I need you to do better instead of I want, because want is a preference and need is a boundary, and I had spent too long confusing the two. I don't know yet what this story becomes. We're still in the middle of it, in the way that marriages are always in the middle of something. But I know that the woman who put those flowers in that vase without thinking twice, she deserved someone who noticed. And if I hadn't packed that bag, hadn't stood in that doorway and said the true thing out loud, she might have kept waiting to be noticed indefinitely. That's not a life. That's just a very long silence.